Does a lack of funding and facilities hamper the potential of African athletes? Athletes all over the world go to Iten in Kenya to train, hoping for a bit of that Kenyan long-distance magic to rub off on them. But the fastest woman in Africa, Blessing Okagbare, lives and trains in the United States. They say the art of conversation is to talk about the right thing at the right time, and this is the right place. You're watching The Conversation. Welcome to The Conversation. I'm Jeanette Kwayke. In the studio with me today is Yomi Ogogbeja, editor of athleticsafrica.com, and joining us on Skype from Spain is sports journalist Phil Minchell. The search for Olympic glory and an edge in long-distance running sees many world-class athletes training in small, high-altitude town of Iten in Kenya. A local running legend wanted to give something back to ensure young Kenyan talent would have access to world-class facilities.
Olympic gold medalists, world record holders, as well as the stars of tomorrow are all being drawn to the modest red dirt Rift Valley destination of Iten in Kenya, fast emerging as the go-to training destination for the world's elite runners. A world-class synthetic track was opened there last February. The Lorna Kiplagat Sports Academy track was built with a grant from the London Marathon to enable both local and international endurance athletes to attend training camps in Kenya.
It's not about the guests. It's about changing the environment. It's about changing what we have never had before. That this is here makes us pleased because the future generation who doesn't have to travel anymore, the future generation can be able to benefit from from the word go. Whether they are very top or they are just starting.
Here, Olympic glory is widely seen as a viable way to riches and fame, providing for the emergence of an unrivaled depth of talent and running culture that visitors can tap into for their training. Hundreds of non-Kenyan runners are now being drawn to the town of just 4,000 people, among them the likes of Britain's Olympic and world champion Mo Farah and women's marathon record holder Paula Radcliffe, both of whom have fled the cold European winter for pre-season training.
Those athletes who train around here, we are very lucky that we have a very good stadium that we are going to train.
So Yomi, welcome to The Conversation. Thank you for joining us. You've just seen on that little short video there the effects of what world-class training can do for athletes in Africa. There are different funding systems all over the world for elite athletes, but can it be said that African athletes are hampered for the lack of facilities and resources that are available to them?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm really impressed with that video, because when you look at long distance, really, most of the training is actually done off track. And for the past few years now, the Kenyans have actually used that. And Kenyans and Ethiopians have dominated the world scene because the young athletes are able to train without actually needing a lot of money to get the tracks, because they can just run the miles and all that. But that's not the same when you look at the shorter distances, which basically now move towards the West African countries, where you need specialized training, equipment and all that, and it all costs money. So I'm kind of impressed that they also think of putting a track there to help them in their speed training and all that, because again, those are the aspects of the long distance races where the East Africans are actually not be very good at.
So why do you think that the African athletics federations don't invest in some of those facilities for their athletes?
Well, there's so many reasons. I think the first one is lack of funding, or lack of adequate funding. and also its lack of priorities. I think most African governments and the sport ministry prioritize football first. So the rest of the money is shared among all the other Olympic sports, which athletics now become part of it. And then when the largest sum of money are going to football, there's basically nothing left for the other federation to scramble around. Another reason also is the state of economy of all these countries, that sport is not actually the main priority of the people. You think about food, health, and education first.
But there's such a rich history of great African athletes from the 80s, from the 90s and the early 2000s. Why can't some of those African federations reignite that?
Yeah, if you look at the 80s and 90s, most of these countries in Africa were very prosperous. The economy of Nigeria, Ghana were much better then. And I think the reason why the West African nations, for instance, were doing well then because they were able to spend money. But what has happened is in the last few years, as the debt crisis and as the economy had gone down, focus have shifted from athletics or from sports really to other things that matters to people.
Phil, I just want to bring you in here. Now, the Jamaicans have managed to do this quite well. They've managed to kind of get their athletes back from the USA and bring them back to Jamaica to train. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's very simple. They've actually created a culture and they've got the coaching expertise, which has managed to attract the athletes to stay in Jamaica. And now it's a feasible proposition for Jamaican sprinters. And even going up to the middle distances now, we're starting to see a few Jamaican 800-meter runners coming through and actually starting to make an impact, even if they're not regularly winning medals. And the funding has been there from the Jamaican government. They've put lots of money in, and also the institutes of higher education, like the University of Technology in Kingston. They've actually got behind their athletes and they've actually supported them, providing them with not just the track's already there and has been there for many years, but also money in terms of living expenses, housing and support, and giving them education. Now, as far as African athletes is concerned, in the vast majority of cases, most talented African athletes who have got any academic ability are going to the United States. And the United States educational system has offered African athletes a way out of their native countries. Very, very few African athletes are staying in an African educational system. That's really why the Jamaicans have been so successful at keeping their sprinters at home, and why Africa is losing so much of its talent, particularly in the technical events like Yomi was talking about.
And that's exactly what we're going to come back and speak about in a second after the break. Please stay with us. We're going to come back to the conversation to talk more about athletics and funding. Welcome back to the conversation. Now let's take a look at some strong opinions about how a lack of funding and infrastructure in other parts of Africa have affected athletics across the continent. Would champion sprinter Blessing Okobare achieved as much without the opportunity she had to train in the United States? So Yomi, we've just seen here the Blessing, a fantastic athlete, a world champion, and someone that Nigeria should be very proud of. But she trains in California, United States. Why can't she be training in Lagos?
Well, you have to look at the fact that, okay, let me take you back from the beginning. Blessing didn't actually go to the United States as a sprinter. She went there as a triple jumper and later long jumper. So basically, she was converted to sprint in the US, in the university by a coach then. So when you look at the fact that there are a lot of athletes that blessed in Nigeria, for instance, but then we've all had to make a choice. I had to make one, and a lot of young people in Africa, in Nigeria right now, are making that choice. It's either you do education or you do sports. Now, for the athletes who want to do sports, they can't go to the United States because they don't have education credentials. So they end up going to Europe with some agents just to run. And then when that's not working for them, they go into different jobs and kind of just get lost in the system. And for those who want to do education, they probably go to university in Nigeria. And after the first degree, they go to the US. They already passed the peak age of sports. So they just go into professions. So Blessing was very lucky because she went to the African Championships and did the triple jump there. So because of that, she was discovered, and through the help of the state government, was able to get scholarship to go to the US.
But then, is there an argument to suggest that she's that good, she could actually, defect to the United States? How would that go down in Nigeria?
I think right now it will be a disaster because she's basically the only person we look up to, as a top-class, world-class athlete for the country. And if you look at the fact that we have a young athlete just like Blessing now, that's what I'm saying, that she was lucky she went at a very early age, at the age where she's kind of trainable. And then being in University of Texas then, she started jumping, then she was converted to the sprints, and then she started doing 100 meters. Yeah. Now we have Issa Brume, who won the long jump gold at the Commonwealth Games and also at the African Championship. She actually, before that, she went to the World Juniors in Oregon, and actually didn't make it to the finals.
Where did she train?
In Benin City, exactly where Blessing was trained in Delta
So
State.
she still trains and lives in Nigeria.
Exactly.
So it's a formula that works then, isn't it? So Phil, why isn't there more African athletes staying where they're based, where they're from, and actually succeeding?
Well, it comes down to the simple theme of this programme. Funding, money, it isn't there. And that's why we've been talking about African athletes, if they've got some educational abilities, going to the US, and if they haven't got quite as many credentials academically, they're probably, as Yomi was saying, racing around Europe. There are one or two small alternatives. The IAAF, for instance, has high-performance training centres and a number of residential schemes across Africa. There's one in Dakar, one in Mauritius, but they're few and far between and certainly can't help the majority of African athletes who've got talent. So consequently, they are leaving their native countries to go and seek fulfillment, if you like, whether it's financial fulfillment of their talent elsewhere. And that's why an awful lot of African athletes, if they aren't in a US educational institution, they're in Europe, they're with European agents, they're staying in European towns. You can look around. Spain, Italy, France, Germany, Great Britain. African athletes are residents in an awful lot of cities and towns right the way across Western Europe, but not just Western Europe now.
There appears to be a lure. There's a financial lure, isn't there? And then Yomi and I were speaking earlier, and I was saying, when does it come down to loyalty? When does it come to patriotism and you wanting to actually compete for your country versus actually defecting to Great Britain or defecting to the United States because of the financial opportunities?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, it's entirely possible, just like a footballer, to ply your trade outside of your own country. But at what point do you decide that you're not getting the support from your own country and decide to then sign up for your adopted homeland? That's been true in football. It's also very true in athletics. You look at French-speaking athletes from West Africa. An awful lot of them are appearing under French colours nowadays. Nigerian athletes have gone to the United States. They've signed up and become residents in the United States. Nigerian athletes have competed for a number of countries over the years. And in fact, the great African diaspora is competing under all sorts of different flags. And of course, at the recent World Cross Country Championships, the entire Bahrain team was made up of people from Ethiopia and Kenya. The lure is there. Now, the big question is, should the member federations do more to actually ensure that loyalty? And that's where the big issue, in my opinion, is the member federations, the national federations, are really not doing enough. The big fault in all of this is the failure of African federations to actually get to grips with this issue and ensure a stream of funding. The
And,
African
that they,
federations
and to use that
so
funding
little
to
about sponsorship.
sorry, Phil, to use that funding to retain their athletes. But then I asked Yomi earlier, as a former athlete yourself, had you been given the opportunity to compete away from Nigeria for a financial, lure, would you have done that?
Yeah, I would have done that, but not for the money. Actually, it's not for money. It's just to achieve something. To fulfill that your potential where you'd be denied at home. And if you look at most athletes, they're not actually going for money. They just want opportunity to compete at the Olympics, to actually do something. If you look at some of the athletes, they know they're good. But because Nigeria, for instance, we have a huge population. And so the competition is fierce. So when you take the top 3 off, what happens to the other athletes? They can go to other countries where they can actually be kings. And at home, nobody reckon with them. If you look at somebody like Kemi Adekoya, for instance, 2 years ago, she was the best junior athlete in Nigeria. And then there was issues with the federation, and she wasn't in the team to go to the World Championship in Moscow. And from there, she was lost interest in that. A year later, I was the one that put it to the federation that this girl is actually competing for Bahrain. So when you look at that...
So what we're actually gonna come back to that after the break. We'll be speaking more about the diaspora and how African athletes can come back to where they're from. Welcome back to the conversation. The African athletics drain has long seen top talent leave for training and financial opportunities elsewhere. Nowhere was this trend more visible than the 2014 Asian Games. Very interesting there on that VT. And I'm going to start with Phil. Phil, what is the actual rules and clarifications on athletes switching allegiance to different countries?
Well, in simple terms, if you've actually competed for a country before, then in theory, you've actually got to then stay out of international competition, although you can compete on the international circuit, you just can't represent the country that you want to go to for 3 years. However, in a lot of cases, the two countries reach an agreement. We've seen this both with Russian and Ukraine athletes taking it out of the African context over the course of the last year. And if you reach agreement, then you can almost immediately, or often 1 year, elapses before you compete again. But then if you haven't competed for a country before, as many promising young junior athletes coming from Africa, and we're talking here about long distance runners from Africa and Kenya and Ethiopia in particular, going to Middle Eastern countries and also Turkey nowadays, then you can go immediately and you can actually, as soon as you get your passport of your new country, you can compete immediately. And that's what's been happening. And that was what was evident not only at last year's Asian Games, but also at the very recent World Cross Country Championships in the Chinese city of Guiyang. I was there.
Phil, do you see this as being much of a problem? Do you think it's going to be something that develops and becomes an issue in athletics?
Well, it already is an issue, and it's been a big issue for almost 15 years. One remembers when the Kenyan Stephen Cherono went to Qatar, because Qatar was actually buying in an awful lot of athletes 10 years ago, which is tended to stop now because they really want major sporting events, and they've realized that this is a little bit morally questionable in many respects. But when Stephen Cherono went to Qatar, he went for the money. He could have been a world record breaker in Kenyan colours, but he went, and it's been a problem ever since. Now Qatar has generally stopped doing it because they want to be a major player in athletics, and it's generally frowned upon. but Bahrain are doing it, Azerbaijan are doing it, Turkey are doing it, and other countries to a lesser extent.
So, Yomi, what do you think actually drives the athlete to take up citizenship of another country? We have spoken about finance and we've spoken about facilities and opportunities. Why is that you can't stick to your country and be loyal to what it is that you know, your nation?
Well, when you talk about loyalties, like, you only be loyal when you actually food in your stomach, right? And for some of the athletes, it's no longer just sports like it used to be in the 60s or 70s. It's now a profession. It's just the same thing as an engineer or a doctor will leave Africa and come to the UK to work as a GP because they want to provide for their families, because they want their families to grow up in a more stable and kind of more prosperous country. So and this is not just new phenomena, because you look at it, I remember in 2004, I spoke with the IWF president, and he said, look, if the African federations cannot develop their facilities and improve on their structure, we will lose the athletes. And that's what's still happening. We're going to lose the athletes because the athletes are just going to move as any other professional in the world for greener pastures.
Well, it's not fair on the African nations, though, is it? Because so many, for example, I could take myself, you know, I could run for Ghana, although I was born in the UK. Both of my parents are from Ghana, and you speak about generations draining athletics.
That's just what I said. This is not a new phenomenon, right? For instance, you can take the first generation, which are the parents who had come to England and France, mostly from African countries, after the end of the colonial era, to work, to live, basically. Now, the children, the first generation, second generation of that family were born here and settled here. And that's why you have people like yourself, Christine, and all that. Those are part of the, not directly, but that's part of the first level of drain. And I wrote about this in 2004. On a story on Athletics Africa called African Drain. And then you have the second generation athletes who actually came, not for the money alone, but also because of frustration with the federation, because of lack of treatment. For instance, someone like Francis Obikwelu. For Nigeria, he was the world junior champion. 4 years later, he was winning the Olympic medal, silver medal, for Portugal. Yeah. And why? Because of little problem, quite a lot of issues with the federation. Someone like Gloria Aloze, for instance. In Sydney 2000, she was running for Nigeria.
But then...
And then she became Spanish.
So,
Why? Because there's so many issues.
You know, and I have to
ask
Phil, if the African diaspora that's running for all these Western countries were to go back and compete for Africa, what would happen to some of these athletics teams in Europe?
Well, I think the athletics teams in Europe would still continue to be very, very strong. I mean, you look at the powerhouses like Germany and Russia, and they don't tend to have too many African or athletes of African origin in their teams. Of course, it may weaken slightly the likes of France and Great Britain, and other teams would come up. I mean, I think it would actually have an effect, of course, but I think actually it would have a positive effect, much, much more so, on the African countries. It would be restoring a lot of their talent back to Africa. The infrastructure's already there in France, Germany, Britain. Other athletes will come through. It isn't there in Africa. They need the talent from the outset.
So I think, you know, just listening to both of you, there is room for improvement.
Yeah, there is. And also, like, what I said is the federation now needs to focus on bringing people. And Nigeria has been doing that. So we've kind of done it in reverse. What they've been doing actually is now bringing back African diaspora to run. These are not Nigerians who left, but this is Nigerians, Americans. And also even Americans that have no business with Nigeria at all had come to run for Nigeria at the African Championship last year in Marrakesh. So you basically have Black African Americans now saying, okay, I want to be a Nigerian.
And that, for me, is a completely different topic at the same time.
This year I've had like 20 or different athletes sending emails to Athletics Africa wanting information about how they can run for the Nigerian, or the Ghanaian, all the South African teams.
Well, I think Yomi's just thrown us a whole other conversation for another show. And I'd like to thank you and both Phil for coming on today, and for you for tuning in to this week's edition of The Conversation. Thank you very much. I'm Jeanette Kwayke, and hopefully you will not forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and don't forget to post your own opinions and queries. It's time to start Africa's sporting conversation.